doesn't have the credit card it had under George Bush to write checks for what amounts to about $5 trillion to wage war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's a version of that. And then you have that war taking place in the context of a global crisis, a set of global chaos and insecurity that's going on all around the world. And in the US, where there is massive insecurity because the economy has not recovered, it's only recovered for the rich. For ordinary people, let alone for the poorest among us, it is very far from recovered, and it was not very good to begin with. There was just one statistic I want to throw out. I heard this the other day in a speech from Janet Yellen, the head of the Federal Reserve. And I rarely read her speeches. I barely know what the Federal Reserve even does. But I do know it's important. So I saw this on the front page of the Times business section. I thought I better read it. And in her speech, she referenced this one particular statistic that just floored me. That in the period from 1996 to 2013, the percentage of wealth in the US that's controlled and owned by the bottom half of our population, the bottom 50%, had declined. Not a surprise, right? What was the shocker was it had declined from 3% to 1%. 1% of the wealth of this country that is wealthier than any other country in the history of the world, 1% is owned by half the people of this country. Can somebody please turn off your cell phone? Sorry, it is really distracting. It was a shocking thing to see. The other thing that I think we have to deal with on a global level, which comes back, and I'm going to spend the last part of when I talk about today talking about what we need to do as a movement. But one of the aspects of that is looking at where is the fight back coming from. And there's fight back on a bunch of different levels all around the world. There's the Occupy versions in many places around the world, the Indignados in Spain. We're seeing this in so many places around the world. The Arab Spring was perhaps the most concentrated sense of a fight back against oppression, against colonization, against a whole bunch of things. But increasingly, particularly when you look at armed opposition, the opposition is taking an Islamist form. Now, that's not something I'm particularly happy about. I'm a pretty secular girl, and I'm not so keen on having religious frameworks for anybody to have to live under. But we don't get to choose the nature of movements except those that we build ourselves. We don't get to choose what kind of movements arise around the world to oppose what our government is doing around the world. And the Islamist movements, the extremists among them and the non-extremists among them, are all rising in response to what our government is doing around the world. That's where our obligation comes in, to change what our government is doing, regardless of who it is on the ground that is fighting back. We may support them, we may not. They may be horrific, as some of these organizations are, violent, extremist, but they are fighting against something imposed by our government. And that's what we have to take seriously. There are differences in the political context in which we work now when we're talking about an anti-war movement. One of them is that, unlike the first 6 years of the war in Iraq and the first 8 years of the war in Afghanistan, the war is not what defines US policy, either for people in this country or for people around the world. In that period, Bush's war in Afghanistan and Iraq, especially Iraq, was the point of the arrow of how people understood what Bush policies were all about. That's no longer the case, partly because of the economic crash. People's lives are so desperate that most people don't have time to think about the consequences of where our tax money is going when we talk about how much the Pentagon gets of our taxes. It's just too desperate. So that is one of the big differences that we have to look at. Another is that there's been political shifts back and forth in our own government, so that we don't have in the White House the main cheerleader for war, who has been looking for an excuse to go to war. It doesn't change the nature of the war, but it changes the politics that we have to understand in fighting back. So when we say, for example, that what Obama says when he says there is no military solution, and we say, yeah, that's true, and instead we need diplomacy, we need new negotiations, we need more money for humanitarian refugee support, et cetera, and we have our whole list of what it should look like, people will come back and say, well, wait a minute, this administration is doing all those things. It's also doing the military. We have to have a much more nuanced understanding of what that means. Yeah, because they are going through the motions. They are talking about diplomatic this and that. They are talking about negotiating here and there. The problem is all of those efforts are undermined by the militarization of foreign policy that is at the root. But we have to talk about it differently because there are different political forces at play. Again, it doesn't mean that it changes the nature of the war on the ground. The children that are dying when the U.S. says we're attacking an ISIS pickup truck and it turned out to be 2 civilian adults and 2 kids, they're just as dead. But what it takes to fight back has to reflect the political moment that we are in now and not the political moment we were in when these wars began. So what we are dealing with is a situation where the claim that we will not have boots on the ground has already been proved a lie. We now are doubling down. You know, there's been all these calls on Obama needs to double down now that the Republicans have both houses of Congress. Well, he's doubling down. The problem is he's doubling down on troops. You know, as of yesterday, as soon as these guys go, there will be more than about 3,100 U.S. troops on the ground, boots on the ground. Some of them are special forces. Maybe they wear sneakers. I don't know. But these are troops on the ground. Are they combat troops? Well, they're not called combat troops. Are they armed? Well, yeah, of course they're armed. And are they near the fighting? Well, yeah, that's the big change here. They're not going to be just back at headquarters. They're going to be like in there fighting. And when they get shot at, are they allowed to? Well, of course, when it's self-defense. But that's not combat, really. What is it exactly? You know, so this is the kind of language shifts that the weasel words that we need to look at. Now, yikes. I was going to go through a bit of the history of ISIS and what we're actually looking at. I think I'm not. Yeah? Oh. Jeez. Isn't that cute? Look at all of you. Okay, quick. So ISIS comes out of opposition to U.S. occupation. Remember I said that earlier? It's true. ISIS began in Iraq, not in Syria. It began as Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. And then, like these groups do, like other groups do, like we on the left do, like people in the center do, like everybody does in organizations, they fight with each other, they argue, they kick each other out of coalitions, right? We've all been there. When there are armed groups doing it, the price is higher. People die. But in this case, what you saw was a series of battles for power and for over some theological differences between the Al-Qaeda leadership and what had emerged as the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They emerged to fight the U.S. occupation. In the meantime, they were also fighting against the Iraqi Shia militia forces, who were sometimes fighting against the U.S. presence, but other times were fighting on the side of the government that the U.S. had installed. So it's been, as you know, a very messy sectarian scene in Iraq. ISIS grew out of that. With the so-called Sunni awakening, which was basically what we might call the Sunni payoff, where Sunni tribal leaders who had been fighting against the U.S. were bought off and convinced to fight for a while on the side of the U.S. against the Shia militias, who had also been fighting on the side of the U.S., but now were fighting against them. You know, if you can keep all this straight, it's not that, on some levels it's not that important. What is important is that the U.S. put in place a sectarian framework that destroyed the secular social fabric of Iraq. Doesn't mean it was a great government before. It was a horrific government. But for most people in Iraq, it was a pretty secular life where the gap between wealth and poverty was relatively small. And the U.S. invasion and occupation, after 12 years of crippling sanctions that had shredded the social fabric of the country, absolutely destroyed that social national existence. and put in place something very different that was very, very toxic and remains so. So this rise and fall of sectarianism has been all kind of rising and falling within a greatly escalated level of sectarian violence. It's dropped at some points and gone up at other points, but it has remained much higher than it ever was before the US sanctions and invasion and occupation. So it's in that context that ISIS emerged. They kind of faded away in around 2009 and 10. They reemerged in Syria in 2011 in the context of the Syrian civil war, which, the quick down and dirty version of that, because I really don't have time to go into it, at my last count is at least 7 separate wars that are being waged now in Syria. It doesn't mean that they're all being waged by different forces. Some of them are by the same forces. But there are 7 conflicts being fought out to the last Syrian. So those include the original conflict between a large number, not everybody, but a large number of Syrians against a very repressive government, a regional battle for power between largely Iran and Saudi Arabia, a regional sectarian battle also headed by Iran and Iran and Saudi Arabia. The US-Israel versus Iran nuclear battle is partly being fought there. The US-Russia battle over sea lanes and a host of other issues is being fought out there. A secular sectarian battle within the Syrian opposition. And then the most recent one, I think this gets to be to 7, the battle within the Islamist opposition in Syria between ISIS and the others. So there's at least 7 wars underway in Syria, and it was in the context of that chaos that ISIS emerged first in Syria and then began the dismantling of the border between Iraq and Syria. And remember, this is a colonial border. ISIS is by far not the only force in the region that would like that border to disappear. These were the artificial borders set in place when a Brit and a French guy sat with a globe and drew lines in the sand after World War II, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And it was all based on who's going to get what. The French get something, the Brits get something. We're going to create Kuwait so the Brits could have guarantees of oil when Iraq was created as a nation state. Syria was divided so that Lebanon became a place to make sure that the French had a place where there was a Catholic government in power. You know, it was all these trade-offs among the colonial powers. It's not surprising that people think that these borders are not helpful. The borders need to go. But in this case, the border has largely disappeared, and you now have the transmission of fighters, of money, and especially of weapons back and forth across the border to the detriment of everybody who's living there on all sides. So who is supporting ISIS? How did they get so powerful? The quick version is that they're supported on the outside by oil companies who they're trading with because they now control a little, you know, Syria is not a huge oil producer, but it's a not insignificant oil producer, and a lot of the oil is now under ISIS control. So oil companies are supporting them. There's a black market through Turkey and elsewhere. Weapons are coming in, flooding in from the Gulf states, from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from Qatar. Now, how much of it is coming from government officials and how much from wealthy individuals, some tied to the government, some not? Nobody knows that for sure. There's lots of allegations, but what's clear is governments are involved. They're at least looking the other way. In some cases, they're almost certainly providing the weapons directly. Some of it is coming from individuals. There's a level of support globally from young, disaffected, ideologically motivated young people who are going off to fight. When I was in Europe recently talking with people about this, in the Netherlands, for instance, a very secular country, there's a number of young Dutch people, youngsters who are going off thinking they're going to go fight for ISIS because they're so disaffected from their own society, without jobs, without any sort of hope. So it's a mess. Now, what's important is that inside Iraq, they're getting support beyond that. They're getting support from significant sectors of the Sunni community. Not by any means, not by any stretch of the imagination, let's try it that way. Are they getting support from all Sunnis? They are attacking Sunnis. They have been killing Sunnis recently. There's been horrific attacks. But there have been significant levels of support from some Sunni tribal leaders who have supported ISIS with their militias in tow. They are getting military training and a lot of military strategy work from generals who were kicked out of the military when that had been part of Saddam Hussein's military, who were kicked out when the U.S. first took power in Iraq, and remember the first thing they did was to dismantle the army. Very smart, right? 300,000 people with guns, fire them and send them home with their weapons. What a surprise. Those guys have emerged really, really angry, and some of them are now fighting with ISIS. So it's a mess, and that's just that part of the world. We're not even talking about Palestine. We're not even talking about Iran. I'll leave that to Stephen to talk about. The one place where the Obama administration has the possibility of a victory could be around a grand bargain with Iran. And right now, I am really depressed that they're going to blow it. I mean, it's possible that people in Iran will blow it also, but I'm more worried, frankly, that people in Washington are going to blow it. So let me just shift 3 more minutes on the question of what do we do? How do we build a movement around this? Now, I know, and what was so impressive, have you all read that incredible paper that was supposed to be the sort of framework for this? It's really, really good. Read it. Go read it. I got it a couple weeks ago, and I sort of glanced at it and thought, oh, this is pretty good, but I didn't read it seriously until yesterday, and it's really impressive. So go read it. But I'm not going to talk about the whole question of building a broad, progressive movement for peace and justice. I'm going to talk about one part of it, which is the movement against war, the movement for peace, which involves opposition to nuclear weapons, involves opposition to the wars that are being fought now, opposition to the militarization of foreign policy, opposition to the transfer of all of our tax money to the Pentagon, all of those things. What do we do as an anti-war movement? One, we have to challenge the notion that the choice is ever, you either do war or you let them get away with it. You go to war or you do nothing. That is never, ever the choice. So we have to be the ones that come up with the alternatives. It's not enough to say, U.S. out of the Middle East. The U.S. ain't going anywhere out of the Middle East. That's just not a realistic demand. And it's also, for me as an internationalist, it's not quite right. Now, when we want to talk about getting our military out of the Middle East, yeah. Getting our oil companies out of the Middle East, yeah. Getting people out of the Middle East, not so much. That's where we have to, again, have some nuance in how we talk about this. When we challenge this equation about what do, we have to distinguish what does the government need to do, what does civil society need to do. And sometimes they are quite different in what our obligations are as civil society and what our demands are to our own government. There's a wonderful proposal circulating out there, put forward by a group of Syrian women, about what needs to happen to bring an end, to at least begin the process of bringing an end to the war in Syria. It starts with supporting the local ceasefires that are already going on in a number of places and that can be expanded. It starts with ending U.S. bombing because it's making everything worse. They say, we don't need more of your bombs, get out. We don't want this, it's not going to help. They need new negotiations. These are the kinds of alternatives that we should be supporting. Ceasefires, including local ceasefires, and eventually, quickly, moving to call for a complete ceasefire on all sides. An arms embargo, because as long as new arms are flooding in, there's not going to be a ceasefire that holds. And that means the U.S. has to start. That means first, we have to stop sending arms and money to the opposition forces and forcing our allies in the region, the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE, et cetera, to stop sending weapons there. Now, that's no easy feat. The only way it can happen is if they're prepared to threaten that they won't sell any more arms to those countries. Now, the arms industry, as we know, is just about as powerful or more as the Israel lobby. So when we talk about who's a powerful lobby, the arms industry is right up there as perhaps the strongest lobby in the country. They're going to be opposed to it. So we're up against the big guys there. But that has to be part of our demand. There has to be, on that basis, pressure on the other side, on Iran and Syria and Russia, to stop arming the Syrian regime. That's what a ceasefire is ultimately going to have to look like. We need new diplomacy. We need new negotiations. I'm not going to go into all the details of it. But when we look at what our challenges are, remember what it took to convince a majority of people in this country to be against the war in Iraq, and even more difficult, against the war in Afghanistan, which is still going on. We should not forget 35,000 troops are still fighting in Afghanistan. It took a long time. It took years to win popular support to that position, but we did it. What didn't happen, with all of the discourse shift and some shift in the media, What we didn't have was a policy shift. That's not because our movement